In the early decades of the 19th century, the world was vast, mysterious, and filled with empires that seemed eternal. Among them, the Qing dynasty of China stood as one of the most powerful and enduring. It was a land of tradition, order, and culture that stretched back thousands of years. To imagine China at that time is to picture a world of intricate gardens, sprawling rice fields, busy markets filled with tea and silk, and a society rooted deeply in Confucian ideals. China in the early 1800s was not merely a country. It was a civilization that had survived dynasties rising and falling, invasions from nomadic tribes, internal rebellions, and the natural disasters of countless centuries. The Qing dynasty, ruled by the Manchu people from the northeast, had governed China since the mid-1600s. By the 1800s, the Qing emperors were well established as the guardians of the Middle Kingdom, the cultural and political heart of Asia. The Qing system was built on balanced tradition and hierarchy. The emperor was regarded not only as the ruler of China, but as the son of heaven, holding the mandate of heaven itself, the divine right to rule. His word was law, his presence sacred. Beneath him stretched a vast bureaucracy of officials, scholars, and governors who kept order in an empire of hundreds of millions. For the ordinary person, daily life was guided by tradition, respect for elders, devotion to family, and reverence for ancestors. Life in Qing China moved at a slower, gentler pace compared to the frantic industrial revolution unfolding in Europe. The majority of people lived in villages, farming the land as their ancestors had for centuries. Rice paddies shimmered under the sun. Tea bushes rolled across the hills of Fujian. Farmers rose with the sun, tended their crops, and gathered in the evenings for meals of rice, vegetables, and sometimes fish or pork. In the cities, life was busier, but still orderly. Merchants traded silk, porcelain, and tea. Scholars prepared for the grueling imperial examinations, tests that determined entry into the bureaucracy. These exams demanded a lifetime of study, memorization of Confucian classics, and mastery of calligraphy. The Qing dynasty prided itself on stability. Foreign trade existed, but under careful supervision. For centuries, Chinese officials believed that China had everything it needed within its borders. The empire considered itself the center of the civilized world, the Middle Kingdom, and regarded foreign traders as barbarians at its doorstep. Foreign merchants could come, but they had to do so on Chinese terms following strict rules. In the southern city of Canton, today known as Guangzhou, foreign trade was allowed under what was called the Canton system. This system permitted foreign merchants, mostly Europeans, to conduct business only in that single port, and only through licensed Chinese intermediaries known as Hong merchants. The rest of China's coast remained closed to outsiders. European traders respected these rules, even if they resented them, because they were desperate for one thing above all: Chinese tea. Tea had become an obsession in Europe. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, tea drinking was no longer just a habit of the upper classes in Britain. It was a daily ritual for all levels of society. Porcelain teapots and cups became household essentials, and the British East India Company made fortunes importing vast quantities of tea from China. Alongside tea, silk and porcelain also travelled across the seas, fueling Europe's fascination with Chinese goods. But trade was not balanced. The British bought immense amounts of tea, silk and porcelain, but China showed little interest in European goods. Chinese officials often dismissed European products as inferior or unnecessary. Why import foreign goods when China already produced so much? The only thing the Chinese accepted in exchange for tea and silk was silver, and so silver flowed steadily from Britain into China, creating an economic imbalance that deeply worried British merchants and officials. This imbalance set the stage for trouble. The British East India Company, searching for a solution, turned to something far more dangerous than woolens or machinery. They turned to opium. But before we arrive at that dark chapter, it is important to imagine once more the peace and beauty of China before the arrival of the drug trade. This was a world filled with tradition, the delicate art of Chinese painting, the poetry of scholars who wrote about mountains and rivers, the Confucian rituals carried out in family homes, and the quiet, ordered streets of walled cities. It was a land that seemed timeless, resilient, unshaken by the storms that had toppled so many other empires. The Qing dynasty of the early 1800s still held prestige across Asia. Neighbouring states paid tribute, acknowledging the supremacy of the Chinese emperor. Korea, Vietnam, and other kingdoms sent envoys bearing gifts, participating in elaborate rituals of respect. To the emperor and his court, this tribute system confirmed what they already believed, that China was the cultural and political centre of the world. But beneath this appearance of stability, cracks were beginning to show. Population growth had placed enormous strain on farmland. By the early 1800s, China's population had risen to over 300 million, perhaps even 400 million, depending on estimates. This rapid growth meant that land was scarce, poverty widespread, and many families lived on the edge of survival. Local officials were often corrupt, siphoning taxes and abusing their power. For those living in the countryside, life could be harsh. Famines, floods, and droughts returned regularly, forcing families into desperate struggles. Still, the empire persisted, confident in its traditions. Few could have imagined that within just a few decades, foreign merchants carrying a bitter drug would plunge China into chaos and humiliation. At the heart of the Qing dynasty during this time was the Daoguang Emperor, who ruled from 1820 to 1850. He was a cautious, serious ruler, deeply concerned about the growing problems facing his empire. He inherited a throne still decorated with splendour, but also weighed down with challenges. Silver was flowing out of China. Officials were corrupt, and unrest simmered beneath the surface. The emperor would soon find himself facing one of the greatest crises in China's long history. Before opium spread across the land, however, China remained proud and self-assured. To imagine it is to see a world of scholars bent over scrolls by candlelight, of farmers guiding water buffalo through flooded rice paddies, of tea leaves drying in the sun, and of merchants carefully packing porcelain into crates bound for ships waiting in Canton. It was a civilization certain of its place at the centre of the world. What neither the emperor nor his officials could foresee was that a foreign substance, small blocks of dried sap, brown and sticky, carried from distant India, would soon begin to unravel their empire. For now, the year is around 1800, The Qing dynasty is still strong. The world beyond China is changing, but the empire believes itself secure, and in the distance across the sea, merchants and officials of the British East India Company are calculating, planning, and preparing to use opium to solve their trade imbalance. The story of opium is about to begin. In the quiet rhythm of Qing China, daily life unfolded much as it had for centuries. But far away, across oceans and continents, the world was changing rapidly. Europe, once fragmented and agrarian, was in the midst of an industrial transformation. Steam engines powered new factories, coal mines lit the furnaces of progress, and cities swelled with workers. Nations like Britain, France, and others were hungry, not only for coal and iron, but for commodities that could not be found within their borders. One of those commodities was tea. In the 18th and 19th centuries, tea was no longer just a drink in Europe. It was a ritual, a comfort, a necessity. From the drawing rooms of London's elites to the humble cottages of rural England, tea became the drink of choice. Morning tea, afternoon tea, tea shared with guests. It was woven into the fabric of society. By the early 1800s, Britain alone was importing millions of pounds of Chinese tea each year. The East India Company, Britain's great trading enterprise, held a monopoly over this trade. Chartered in 1600, it had grown from a band of merchants into a powerful institution with its own army, its own ships, and its own influence over government policy. By the 19th century, the company was not only a trader in spices, textiles, and tea, it was also a ruler, controlling vast swathes of India. To understand the story of opium in China, one must understand the company's position in India. Over the course of the 18th century, Britain had expanded its control across the Indian subcontinent. By the 1800s, Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India, was firmly under company rule. Bengal was fertile, producing rice, textiles, and most importantly for this story, opium. Opium was not a new discovery. It had been known since ancient times, used in small doses as a medicine for pain and sleeplessness. The poppy from which it came produced a milky sap that, when dried, became a powerful narcotic. In India, the British organised large-scale cultivation of the opium poppy. Farmers were required to grow the crop under company contracts. The opium was processed into dense, sticky cakes and then sold at auctions in Calcutta. From there, private traders, often working in coordination with the company, shipped it to markets across Asia. But one market was more promising and more dangerous than all others: China. By the early 1800s, British merchants faced a serious problem. China demanded silver for its tea and silk, draining Britain's reserves of the precious metal. The East India Company needed a way to reverse the flow, to sell something to China that would be just as irresistible as tea was to Britain. The answer was opium. At first, opium was a limited trade. Some merchants smuggled small amounts into China through the southern coast, but demand grew steadily. What began as a trickle soon became a flood. Chinese officials banned opium, recognizing its dangers, but the drug spread regardless. European traders did not sail directly into China's harbours with their cargo. Instead, they anchored off the coast, particularly near Linton Island in the Pearl River Delta. From these floating depots, smugglers carried opium ashore, often at night, distributing it to secret networks of dealers. The trade was technically illegal, but it was lucrative beyond measure. For British merchants, the profits were staggering. They bought opium cheaply in India and sold it in China for many times the price. With those earnings, they purchased tea, silk and porcelain, sending them back to Britain. The trade imbalance shifted. Silver began to flow out of China, not into it. For China, however, the consequences were devastating. At first, only a small fraction of the population used opium, but as availability increased, so did addiction. Scholars, merchants, farmers, even soldiers fell victim to the drug's grip. Smoking opium became a ritual in itself, a pipe, a flame, a slow inhalation, and a drift into dreamlike calm. But repeated use brought dependency, weakness, and ruin. The Qing government saw the danger. Emperors and officials issued edicts banning opium smoking and trade. Severe punishments were declared for those who sold or consumed it. But enforcement was difficult. Coastal smugglers bribed officials, local authorities turned a blind eye, and the demand only grew stronger. In Europe, the moral questions of this trade were rarely asked. Merchants saw profits. The East India Company saw a solution to its financial imbalance. The British government, while not directly managing the smuggling, benefited indirectly from the taxes and revenues tied to tea. The system was profitable, and profit outweighed concern. Yet beyond the ledgers and ships, there was also a cultural misunderstanding at play. Many Europeans of the time believed China was closed, backward, and in need of being open to the world. They saw the Canton system, the strict regulation of trade to a single port, as restrictive and insulting. British merchants and officials believed they had the right to free trade, the right to sell their goods, and the right to be treated as equals by the Qing Empire. The Chinese, for their part, believed they had nothing to learn from foreigners. They saw the British not as partners, but as barbarians who should be controlled and contained. These two perspectives, Britain's hunger for open markets and China's desire for control, were destined to clash, and the substance that would ignite this conflict was opium. By the 1820s and 1830s, the scale of the trade had become enormous. Tens of thousands of chests of opium entered China each year. Each chest contained about 140 pounds of the drug. In total, hundreds of tons of opium were being smuggled into the empire annually. The addiction crisis spread, and silver flowed out of the country in vast quantities. This drain of silver weakened China's economy, disrupted agriculture, and fueled corruption. The Dongguan Emperor, who ruled during these years, watched with growing alarm. He issued repeated bans on the trade, urged his officials to take stronger measures, and sought ways to cut off the supply. But the empire's bureaucracy was slow, its officials often corrupt, and its coastline too vast to police effectively. Meanwhile, across the seas, Britain was changing even more. The Industrial Revolution had made the nation stronger, richer, and more confident. Its navy ruled the oceans. Its merchants demanded more access, more trade, more markets. Britain saw itself not as a supplicant to the Chinese emperor, but as a rising power that should not be restricted by outdated traditions. And so, as the 1830s unfolded, the stage was set for conflict. Britain, armed with ships and cannons, believed it had the right to open China by force if necessary. China, proud and confident in its traditions, believed it could resist. Between them lay the poisonous trade of opium, growing every year, destroying lives and undermining the very foundations of the Qing Empire. The world beyond China was no longer content with limited trade through Canton. Europe wanted more access, more ports, more influence, and to achieve it, Britain would soon send not only merchants, but warships. At first, opium in China was not a crisis. For centuries, small amounts of the drug had been used as medicine. Physicians prescribed it in tiny doses for pain, sleeplessness, or digestive troubles. Mixed with other herbs, it had a place in the traditional pharmacopoeia of Chinese medicine. In these small, careful amounts, it was neither unusual nor especially dangerous. But the opium that poured into China from British merchants was not medicine. It was not the careful application of a healer. It was large, concentrated, and meant for smoking. And smoking opium was different. The effects were stronger, faster, and more addictive. The ritual of smoking opium soon developed its own culture. In small rooms, often dimly lit, smokers reclined on couches or bamboo mats. An attendant prepared the pipe, heating a small ball of opium over a flame until it softened. The thick brown substance was then placed into the pipe's bowl and gently heated until smoke rose. The smoker inhaled slowly, deeply, and then exhaled, sinking into a state of dreamlike calm. Time slowed, worries faded, muscles relaxed. For a moment the world seemed distant, soft and harmless. But that dream did not last. Soon the smoker longed for another pipe, and then another. Dependency crept in quietly. A person who once smoked occasionally found himself smoking daily. A person who smoked daily found himself unable to work, unable to concentrate, unable to live without it. By the 1820s and 1830s, this pattern was repeating itself across China. In coastal cities, opium dens multiplied. At first, they catered to the wealthy, merchants, scholars, even officials, who could afford the imported drug. For these men, opium smoking became a social pastime, a way to relax and display refinement. Pipes were crafted with elegance, some inlaid with silver or jade, turning the act into something of a luxury. But as the trade grew, prices fell and opium spread beyond the wealthy. Farmers in villages, labourers in cities, soldiers in garrisons, all began to fall under its sway. Addiction was no longer confined to elite circles. It reached into the countryside, into the army, and into the households of ordinary people. Reports from the time describe villages where half the men were addicted. Soldiers who should have been training and guarding the empire were instead lying in smoke-filled rooms, too weak to fight. Families sold belongings to buy opium. Silver coins, once the foundation of China's stable economy, flowed out of the country in exchange for the drug. The scale of the trade was astonishing. By the late 1830s, estimates suggest that more than 40,000 chests of opium, each weighing around 140 pounds, entered China each year. That meant over 5 million pounds of the drug, smuggled through coastal waters, carried by secret networks inland, and sold in towns and villages across the empire. The consequences were visible everywhere. Farmers neglected their fields. Merchants lost fortunes chasing the next pipe. Sons inherited not land or tools, but debts and cravings. Officials, once respected for their dignity, were found nodding in opium dens. The empire that prided itself on Confucian morality, on self-discipline, family duty and loyalty to the state, was being hollowed out from within. The Daoguang emperor was deeply troubled. He issued repeated bans, urging his officials to root out the trade. In edicts, he spoke of the dangers of opium, of how it weakened the body and corrupted the mind. Punishments grew harsher. Sellers were to be executed. Users were to be fined and shamed. But the bans were ineffective. For every official who enforced the law, another accepted bribes to look the other way. For every chest of opium destroyed, dozens more slipped ashore under cover of darkness. The emperor's frustration grew so intense that he once declared, "If the opium problem is not solved, our dynasty will soon face its end." He was not wrong. Opium's spread was not only a matter of health and morality, it also became an economic disaster. For centuries, China's economy had been fueled by silver. Farmers paid taxes in silver, merchants traded with silver, and silver coins circulated widely. But as Chinese buyers spent their silver on opium, the metal drained out of the country and into the hands of foreign merchants. Prices of basic goods became unstable. Government revenues declined. The state struggled to pay soldiers and officials. A once strong economy was being siphoned away by addiction, and yet, despite the clear harm, demand for opium only grew stronger. Addiction was merciless. Once a person fell into its grip, quitting was nearly impossible without great suffering. Those who tried to stop faced fevers, chills, sweating, stomach pains, and overwhelming cravings. Many relapsed quickly, preferring the calm of the pipe to the agony of withdrawal. As the drug spread, so too did despair. Families watched loved ones waste away. Communities weakened as labourers abandoned their work. Soldiers deserted or proved useless in battle. The empire's moral foundation, built on the values of discipline, responsibility, and family duty, began to erode. Still, there were those who resisted. Some local officials, angered by the destruction they saw, tried earnestly to enforce the bans. Smugglers were arrested, pipes were broken, chests of opium were seized and burned. But the scale of the trade was simply too large. British merchants anchored off the coast had endless supplies. Smugglers were clever and determined. Corruption was widespread. By the late 1830s, the Daoguang emperor knew that ordinary bans and punishments would not be enough. Something stronger, more decisive would be required. And so he turned to a man of unusual integrity and determination, Commissioner Lin Zexu. Lin was a scholar official with a reputation for honesty. He did not accept bribes. He worked tirelessly. He was deeply loyal to the emperor and devoted to saving the empire from the scourge of opium. When he was appointed to lead the fight, he accepted with solemn determination. He knew the task would be immense, but before Lin could act, the damage had already been done. By the time the 1830s came to a close, millions of Chinese were addicted. The economy was weakened, the military was compromised, and foreign merchants, backed by the power of the British Navy, were more determined than ever to protect their profitable trade. The opium pipe, simple and small, had become a weapon more destructive than any army. And soon China would discover that behind the smoke of the pipe lay the thunder of cannons. The year was 1839. The Qing dynasty, proud yet troubled, faced a crisis that could no longer be ignored. For years, opium had spread like a shadow across the empire. The The Daoguang Emperor had issued ban after ban, but the drug continued to pour in, smuggled along the coast, carried up rivers, traded in markets both hidden and open. Now the emperor was determined to act. He called upon a man whose reputation for honesty and diligence stood above the corruption of so many others. His name was Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu was a scholar and official who had risen through the ranks of the civil service by virtue of his intelligence, hard work, and incorruptible nature. Unlike many of his peers, he did not take bribes. He did not turn away from responsibility. He believed deeply in Confucian ideals of morality, order, and service to the state. When he was appointed imperial commissioner with full authority to end the opium crisis, he accepted the mission with solemn resolve. Arriving in Canton in 1839, Lin moved swiftly. He did not hesitate, nor did he compromise. He issued stern proclamations warning both Chinese subjects and foreign merchants that the opium trade would no longer be tolerated. He ordered local dealers to hand over their supplies. He commanded smokers to break their pipes and swear oaths never to smoke again. But his greatest challenge lay not with ordinary citizens, but with the foreign traders. These men, British, American, and others, anchored their ships off the coast, bringing chest after chest of opium from India. Their profits were enormous, and they had little interest in giving up the trade. Lin understood that persuasion alone would not work, and so he took dramatic action. He surrounded the foreign factories, the trading warehouses where merchants conducted business in Canton, and demanded that all opium be surrendered. For 6 weeks, the merchants were essentially besieged, cut off from supplies, unable to continue their trade. Lin made it clear there would be no negotiation, no compromise. The opium must be handed over. At last, under pressure, the British merchants complied. In the spring of 1839, over 20,000 chests of opium, amounting to more than £2 million, were surrendered to Lin Zexu and his officials. It was one of the largest drug seizures in history. What followed was an event both symbolic and practical. At Human, near Canton, the confiscated opium was destroyed. Workers dug great trenches, lined them with stone, and filled them with water and lime. Chest after chest was opened, its contents poured out, its sticky brown contents dissolved and rendered useless. The work took weeks. Clouds of smoke and bitter fumes rose as the opium was neutralized and washed into the sea. For Lin Zexu, this was a triumph, a moral cleansing of the empire. He wrote proudly to Queen Victoria of Britain, urging her to recognize the righteousness of China's cause and to end her subjects' involvement in the drug trade. But Britain did not see it that way. To the British merchants, the destruction of their opium was a massive financial loss. To the British government, it was an insult, an affront to their national pride and commercial interests. The principle of free trade, which Britain championed, had been challenged. The British demanded compensation for the destroyed opium. The Qing government refused. At home, debates raged in the British Parliament. Some politicians condemned the trade as immoral, questioning why Britain should defend the trafficking of a drug that was destroying millions of lives. Others, however, argued that national honour and economic interests were at stake. Britain's merchants could not be left unprotected. the loss of the opium had to be answered. In the end, the voices of commerce and pride prevailed. The British government decided to send a naval force to China, not just to demand compensation, but to force open new opportunities for trade. The British fleet that sailed to China in 1839 was small compared to the great armies of Europe, but it was modern, disciplined, and well-armed. It carried steam-powered gunboats, ships that could maneuver regardless of wind and tide, and cannons capable of devastating bombardment. The Qing military, by contrast, was outdated. Its armies were large but poorly trained. Its weapons were old, many still reliant on bows, swords, and muskets from centuries past. Its navy was composed of wooden junks, impressive in number but weak against modern warships. The first clashes quickly revealed the imbalance. In November 1839, British and Chinese forces fought at the Battle of Chunpi near the Pearl River Delta. British ships with superior firepower destroyed Chinese junks and easily controlled the waters. For the Qing officials, the sight was shocking. Their once proud fleet shattered in hours by a handful of foreign vessels. As the war spread, the pattern repeated. In battle after battle, the British used their ships and cannons to overpower Chinese defences. Forts crumbled under bombardment. Towns along the coast fell. The British Navy sailed northward, blockading key ports, threatening the great city of Nanjing itself. For the Chinese people, the war was bewildering and terrifying. Coastal villages were shelled. Civilians fled as foreign troops advanced. Merchants faced ruin as trade was disrupted. Soldiers, often poorly equipped and underpaid, struggled to resist. Many deserted, unwilling to face the thunder of British cannons. The Qing government, confident in its moral authority but unprepared militarily, found itself humiliated. Messages from commanders spoke of defeat after defeat. Supplies dwindled. The treasury, already strained by silver outflows from the opium trade, could not sustain the costs of war. Meanwhile, the British advanced steadily, not only for compensation but for concessions. They demanded access to more ports, fairer treatment for their merchants, and territorial control. By 1842, the Qing had no choice but to negotiate. The war had revealed the empire's weakness. It could not match the technology, discipline, and naval strength of Britain. Defeat was undeniable. The result was the Treaty of Nanjing, signed in August 1842. This treaty marked a turning point in Chinese history. It was the first of what would come to be called the unequal treaties, agreements imposed on China by foreign powers. The terms were harsh. China was forced to pay a large indemnity to Britain for the costs of the war. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were open to British trade and residents. British merchants gained new privileges, free from many of the restrictions of the old Canton system. Most significantly, the island of Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, to be held as a crown colony. The Treaty of Nanjing did not mention opium. Officially, the trade remained illegal under Chinese law, but in practice the treaty created the conditions for it to flourish even more. With new ports open and foreign merchants established more securely, smuggling became easier and the trade continued to grow. For the Qing dynasty, the First Opium War was a humiliation unlike any it had faced in centuries. The empire that had long regarded itself as the centre of the world, superior to all others, had been forced into submission by a foreign power it once dismissed as a distant barbarian kingdom. The psychological blow was immense. Confidence in the dynasty's ability to protect the nation weakened. Ordinary people saw their rulers defeated, their coasts vulnerable, their sovereignty compromised. The authority of the emperor and the prestige of the Qing order were shaken. For Britain, the war was a triumph. The opening of Chinese ports promised vast profits. Hong Kong became a strategic hub, a gateway for commerce and naval power in Asia. Merchants celebrated the opportunities that now lay before them, but for China the war was only the beginning of a long and painful era. The Treaty of Nanjing set a precedent. Other foreign powers, France, the United States, later Russia and Japan, would demand similar privileges. The age of unequal treaties had begun, and the opium trade, the very issue that had sparked the war, did not disappear. Instead, it expanded, flooding into China in ever greater quantities. The destruction of 20,000 chests at Human had been dramatic, but it was only a temporary interruption in a tide that could not be stopped by edicts or trenches. The First Opium War was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of world views. For Britain, it was about trade, profit, and the principle of access. For China, it was about sovereignty, morality, and survival. The two sides spoke past one another, unable to reconcile their perspectives. In the end, it was force that decided the outcome, and force favoured Britain. For China, the defeat of 1842 was the opening of a long chapter of weakness, foreign intrusion, and internal turmoil. The Qing dynasty, once strong, had begun its decline. The opium pipe, the smuggler's ship, the cannon's roar, all were threads in the tapestry of a tragedy that would shape China's 19th century. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing. For many, it seemed as though the immediate conflict had concluded. Peace, in its own uneasy way, settled over the southern coasts of China. But the years between the First and Second Opium Wars, stretching roughly from 1842 to 1856, were far from tranquil. They were years of quiet humiliation, slow adjustment, and creeping change. To understand these years is to understand a China forced to reckon with a new reality, a world in which foreign powers could impose their will, trade could no longer be fully controlled, and the empire's sovereignty was increasingly compromised. The Treaty of Nanjing had opened 5 ports to foreign trade: Canton, Amoy, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. British merchants, long confined to Canton under the restrictive Canton system, now enjoyed access to new ports, greater freedoms, and protection under British law. Hong Kong, ceded to Britain, became a symbol of foreign presence and influence. For the Chinese, this treaty was bitter. It formalized what had been unthinkable, foreign powers dictating terms to the Middle Kingdom. The emperor and his court were humiliated, forced to pay large sums of silver as indemnity, ceding territory and influence. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, faced the consequences in their daily lives. Trade patterns shifted. Coastal towns saw new merchants, warehouses, and foreign administrators arriving. Traditional systems of authority were disrupted, yet life continued in much of the countryside. Farmers still worked their fields, scholars still studied their classics, and families still practiced their rituals. The empire had not yet collapsed, but a subtle erosion of confidence had begun. people could see that the state, once seemingly omnipotent, was vulnerable. The years following the First Opium War saw a gradual expansion of foreign influence across China. The British, having secured their new rights, sought to increase profits and consolidate their position. They pushed for the legalization of opium, arguing that a regulated trade would benefit both sides. Other powers followed suit. France, seeing opportunity, began to press for its own concessions. The United States negotiated similar treaties, gaining trading rights and protections. Russia sought influence in the north. Each nation, in its own way, chipped away at China's ability to control its own trade and borders. Ports like Shanghai transformed. Once quiet fishing towns, they became bustling centres of commerce, filled with warehouses, docks, and foreign residents. Streets echoed with a mix of languages, from English to French to Portuguese. Foreign buildings built in European styles rose alongside traditional Chinese architecture. The presence of foreigners introduced new ideas, new technologies, and inevitably new tensions. For many Chinese, this intrusion was bewildering. The empire had long regarded itself as self-sufficient, confident in its culture and governance. Now, foreigners not only traded freely but claimed legal and territorial privileges. The concept of extraterritoriality, where foreigners were not subject to Chinese law, it was particularly shocking. It was an affront to centuries of tradition and authority. Despite the destruction of thousands of chests of opium at Human, the trade did not end. Smugglers adapted to the new realities. With ports now more accessible, opium moved more easily along established routes. Shipments increased. Consumption spread further inland. Addiction continued to grow, affecting families, communities, and entire regions. Villages reported that half of the adult male population was dependent. Soldiers struggled to maintain discipline. Officials who were meant to enforce the law often turned a blind eye or accepted bribes, as the profits were too tempting to resist. Opium was no longer merely a social or economic issue. It had become a profound political and moral crisis. The empire's resources were strained not only by foreign trade and treaties, but also by the social costs of addiction. Productivity declined, revenues fell, and unrest simmered in the countryside. While foreign powers pressed for influence, internal tensions began to intensify. China's population had grown rapidly during the Qing dynasty, placing pressure on farmland, food supplies, and social services. Corruption among officials was widespread, and many regions suffered from neglect. The most notable internal challenge in these years was the rise of the Taiping movement. Originating in southern China, this religious and social movement combined Christian-inspired beliefs with promises of social reform. Its leaders sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty, challenging not only the emperor's authority but also centuries of tradition. Though the Taiping Rebellion would fully erupt in the 1850s, its roots were evident during this between wars period. Discontent among the poor, famine and corruption created fertile ground for rebellion. The presence of opium compounded these problems, weakening communities and reducing their ability to resist insurgent movements. Other uprisings, smaller but still significant, began to appear in regions affected by economic hardship and foreign intrusion. Banditry increased in some areas. Local militias, often poorly trained and underfunded, struggled to maintain order. The empire, while outwardly intact, was quietly fracturing. Even after his decisive action in the First Opium War, Lin Zexu's work left a complicated legacy. He had demonstrated the possibility of decisive moral governance. He had shown that corruption could be resisted, that foreign traders could be confronted, and that the opium crisis could be tackled, at least temporarily. Yet despite his efforts, the structural challenges remained. Smuggling persisted. The British fleet had demonstrated its superiority. The Qing government, unable to enforce its laws fully, faced a growing sense of helplessness. Lin's moral victory at Human could not translate into lasting control over the trade or protection of the empire. In these years, Lin and other officials pushed for reforms. They advocated stronger coastal defences, better policing of trade, and stricter enforcement of anti-opium laws. They also urged the emperor to strengthen the military and modernise the navy. Some progress was made, but it was slow and limited. The gap between China and the technologically advanced powers of Europe continued to widen. The influx of foreigners and goods combined with the opium trade also introduced new cultural elements. Foreign languages, religions, and customs began to mingle with traditional Chinese society, particularly in port cities. Missionaries arrived, schools and churches were established, and new technologies, printing presses, steamships, and modern weaponry began to appear. For ordinary people, this was both fascinating and disorienting. Some embraced new opportunities, learning English or trading with foreigners. Others resisted, clinging to traditional ways and viewing the newcomers as a threat to Chinese culture and values. This tension between openness and preservation would continue to shape Chinese society for decades. By the mid-1850s, the empire stood at a fragile equilibrium. On the surface, daily life continued. Families tended their fields, scholars studied for the imperial examinations, and markets bustled with trade. Yet beneath this surface, cracks deepened. Foreign powers had gained permanent footholds. The opium trade had expanded beyond control. Internal unrest simmered, foreshadowing rebellions to come. The empire's resources, already strained by lost silver and economic disruption, were insufficient to meet the challenges ahead. The period between the First and Second Opium Wars was, in many ways, a quiet but dangerous interlude. The empire had survived a catastrophic defeat, but the seeds of further conflict were already sown. Britain and other powers, seeing opportunity, were preparing to press their advantages further. And the Qing dynasty, weakened and distracted, faced the slow erosion of its authority. As the 1850s approached, the clouds of war gathered once more. The issues left unresolved after the Treaty of Nanjing, trade rights, legal privileges, opium, and foreign presence, were all causes for renewed conflict. The years between wars were not marked by the dramatic battles of cannon and gunship, but by subtler shifts in power, culture, and society. Foreign influence increased quietly yet inexorably. Social and economic strains deepened, compounded by the persistent scourge of opium. The Qing dynasty, once confident and unassailable, now faced an uncertain future. In these years, the empire learned that defeat in war could not be measured solely by lost territory or indemnities. Defeat could be measured by lost confidence, eroded authority, and the slow corrosion of society from within. And so, as the Second Opium War approached, China would find itself facing an adversary far more determined, technologically superior, and unwilling to respect the limits of traditional diplomacy. The stage was set for the next chapter in a tragic saga, one that would see the empire further humbled, opium flooding even more widely, and the Qing dynasty moving ever closer to the edge of collapse. The uneasy calm of the years following the First Opium War did not last long. By the mid-1850s, the Qing dynasty faced mounting challenges: a weakened military, a struggling economy, growing internal unrest, and the persistent social catastrophe of opium addiction. Foreign powers, particularly Britain and France, were eager to expand their privileges and secure greater access to trade. The conditions were ripe for another confrontation, one that would further humiliate China and accelerate the decline of the Qing dynasty. This confrontation is known as the Second Opium War, also called the Arrow War, which raged from 1856 to 1860. The immediate cause of the Second Opium War was a seemingly minor incident, yet it became the catalyst for a major international conflict. In October 1856, Chinese authorities in Canton seized a ship called the Arrow, which was registered under the British flag but operated by Chinese sailors. The Chinese claimed the ship was involved in smuggling and had violated local laws. The British, outraged, demanded the release of the ship and its crew, asserting that their flag entitled them to protection. The Qing authorities, still wary of foreign interference but recovering from the previous war, refused to yield. France, citing a separate incident involving the killing of a French missionary in Guangxi, joined Britain in demanding compensation and punitive action. What began as a dispute over a ship and a missionary quickly escalated. Britain and France dispatched troops and warships to China, signalling their determination to assert authority and expand privileges. The Second Opium War began in earnest with bombardments of Chinese forts along the Pearl River and the capture of Canton in late 1857. This time, the Qing military faced a far more technologically advanced enemy than before. British and French forces used steam-powered warships, rifled artillery, and disciplined infantry trained in modern European tactics. Chinese forces, still relying on older cannons, junks, and traditional formations, were at a severe disadvantage. In city after city, forts and defences were destroyed, and soldiers were forced to retreat or surrender. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, fleeing the advancing foreign troops or hiding in their homes as cannon fire shattered walls and rooftops. The war escalated as the Allies pushed north along the coast and up the rivers. Shanghai, previously opened as a treaty port, became a major strategic hub for foreign forces. British and French troops occupied key areas, consolidating their control over trade routes and enforcing their privileges. The conflict spread to other regions, including the Bohai and Yellow Seas. The Qing military struggled to coordinate defences across vast distances, and local militias were poorly equipped and insufficiently trained to resist the foreign forces. The empire, once confident in its power, appeared increasingly fragmented and vulnerable. Throughout this period, opium continued to shape events in subtle but profound ways. Smuggling did not cease. In fact, the opening of new ports and the presence of foreign powers made distribution even easier. addiction remained widespread, draining the workforce, reducing productivity, and undermining social stability. For officials attempting to organize resistance, opium addiction among soldiers and bureaucrats weakened their effectiveness. Armies found it difficult to maintain discipline, and corruption, often fueled by profits from opium, sapped administrative efficiency. The very crisis that had sparked the First Opium War was now intertwined with the empire's inability to defend itself effectively in the Second War. Several significant battles defined the Second Opium War. Among them, the Battle of Canton, 1857-1858. British and French forces captured Canton, defeating Qing troops and forcing the city into occupation. The city's fortifications were overwhelmed, and its population endured bombardments and looting. The campaign along the Pearl River, steamships and modern artillery enabled foreign forces to control river traffic, cutting off supplies to Chinese troops and cities. The advance to Tianjin, 1858-1860. The Allies pushed further north, eventually reaching Tianjin, a strategic city near the capital Beijing. The Qing government, weakened and demoralized, was forced into negotiations. Each campaign demonstrated the technological gap between European powers and the Qing dynasty. Chinese soldiers fought bravely but were repeatedly outmaneuvered, outgunned and outpaced by disciplined foreign forces. Civilians, caught in the middle, suffered from the destruction of homes, disruption of trade, and the constant fear of violence. The Second Opium War concluded not with a clear military victory, but with a series of treaties that further humiliated China. The Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 established the opening of more Chinese ports to foreign trade, legalization of the opium trade, formalizing what had long been illicit, extraterritorial rights for foreign citizens, meaning they were subject to their own laws, not Chinese law. Permission for foreign legations, embassies, to be established in Beijing. The Second Opium War concluded not with a clear military victory, but with a series of treaties that further humiliated China. The Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 established. These terms were unacceptable to some Qing officials, and tensions continued, leading to the final phase of the war. In 1860, Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing itself. The city, poorly defended, fell, and the old summer palace, Yuan, a symbol of imperial grandeur and culture, was looted and burned. Priceless treasures, artworks, and documents were destroyed. The destruction of the summer palace was both symbolic and practical, a demonstration of the empire's vulnerability and a message to the Qing court that resistance carried consequences. The Convention of Beijing, 1860, formalized the outcome, confirming the harsh terms of Tianjin, ceding additional territory, and securing permanent privileges for foreign powers. The Second Opium War had devastating consequences for the Qing dynasty and Chinese society. Territorial losses. Hong Kong had already been ceded after the First Opium War, but the Second War expanded foreign presence in cities and ports. Economic strain, indemnities, reparations, and the formal legalization of opium drained silver and undermined fiscal stability. Social disruption, widespread addiction, displacement, and local rebellions continued, weakening communities. Political humiliation. The Qing court, forced to negotiate under duress, suffered a profound loss of prestige and authority. Cultural trauma, the destruction of the Old Summer Palace represented not just a physical loss, but a symbolic attack on Chinese culture and history. By 1860, it was clear that China's traditional systems of governance, military defense and social order, were no longer sufficient to contend with the industrialized powers of the West. The empire's decline, which had begun subtly with opium addiction, had accelerated dramatically through military defeat and political humiliation. The Second Opium War marked a turning point in Chinese history. It was a conflict not solely about trade or territory, but about the clash of civilizations, technologies, and worldviews. The Qing dynasty, once confident in its moral and cultural superiority, now faced the stark reality of industrialized European powers. Opium had played a central role throughout this period. It was not merely a trade commodity, it was a weapon that undermined society from within. Addiction weakened families, communities, and the state. The profits from opium funded foreign expansion and military superiority. The very substance that had first prompted China to act in 1839 now flowed freely under legalized terms, ensuring that its social and economic effects would continue for decades. By the end of the war, the Qing dynasty was left to confront a new reality, a China divided, weakened, and increasingly at the mercy of foreign powers. The empire's struggles would continue, both from within and without, as internal rebellions, corruption, and the lingering effects of opium addiction compounded the challenges of governance. Though active warfare ended in 1860, the consequences lingered for decades. Foreign powers maintained extensive privileges in ports and cities. Opium, now legal under treaty terms, continued to devastate populations. The Qing government, though still ruling nominally, faced ongoing rebellions, fiscal crisis, and a loss of sovereignty that would shape the late 19th century. The Second Opium War was not merely a historical episode of battles and treaties. It was a story of social erosion, moral crisis, and the profound imbalance of power between an industrializing West and a traditional empire. The empire that had once seemed unshakable was now forced to navigate a world in which its authority, traditions, and people were increasingly at risk. The stage was set for further turmoil, including internal revolts like the Taiping Rebellion and later foreign interventions, all occurring against the backdrop of a society struggling with the consequences of opium. The Qing dynasty's resilience would be tested again and again, but the scars of the two opium wars were indelible. By the end of the Second Opium War in 1860, China had endured 2 decades of conflict, humiliation, and transformation. The Qing dynasty, once confident and dominant, now faced a profoundly altered world. The effects of the Opium Wars were not limited to treaties, territories, or military losses. They were deeper, touching the social fabric, the economy, governance, and the very psyche of the empire. To understand the long-term consequences is to see how a society can be reshaped not only by armies and foreign powers, but by addiction, economic pressures, and cultural upheaval. One of the most immediate and lasting consequences of the wars was the formal legalization of opium. Once a clandestine, illicit trade, opium became a legal commodity under treaty terms. British, French, and other foreign merchants could now import the drug without fear of prosecution. the legalization accelerated the social impact of opium addiction. In the decades following the Second Opium War, millions of Chinese continued to fall into dependency. Families were disrupted as men spent silver and time on the drug. Agricultural production declined, labour forces weakened, and local economies suffered. In urban areas, opium dens flourished, blending commerce, socialization, and destruction. Addiction became a generational problem. Sons grew up witnessing fathers debilitated by opium. Entire villages experienced the gradual erosion of health, productivity, and morale. Officials struggled to enforce any remaining restrictions, as corruption and foreign legal protections made the trade difficult to police. The pipe that had begun as a medicinal tool had now reshaped society at every level. Its influence, combined with foreign exploitation, left an enduring mark on China's social landscape. The Opium Wars also had profound economic effects. The outflow of silver, first caused by opium purchases and then compounded by indemnities and treaty obligations, drained the empire's wealth. Government revenues declined, forcing the state to borrow and rely on local elites for funding. Trade patterns shifted drastically. Coastal cities became hubs for foreign commerce, while traditional inland markets struggled. The Qing government lost much of its control over international trade. Unable to regulate prices, enforce tariffs, or protect domestic industries, opium itself became a major economic factor. Its trade, though profitable for foreign merchants, drained Chinese resources. Families sold land, livestock, or savings to purchase the drug. Communities faced shortages of labour as workers succumbed to addiction. The empire's economic foundation, once based on agriculture and local trade, was increasingly undermined. Politically, the wars revealed the Qing dynasty's vulnerabilities and eroded its legitimacy. The imperial court had been forced repeatedly to negotiate under duress, paying reparations, ceding territory, and granting foreign privileges. This was a sharp contrast to the centuries of perceived moral and cultural superiority the dynasty had once enjoyed. Local officials, already struggling with corruption and inefficiency, now faced the additional challenge of enforcing laws that conflicted with foreign treaties. Many were caught between loyalty to the emperor and the practical realities of foreign power, often choosing personal gain over public duty. The Qing government attempted some reforms, particularly in military and administrative organization, but these efforts were slow and uneven. The empire lacked the technological and industrial resources to fully modernize, leaving it increasingly outmatched by Western powers. Culturally, the Opium Wars and their aftermath introduced a sense of vulnerability and loss. The destruction of the Old Summer Palace in 1860 was particularly symbolic. Beyond its architectural and artistic value, it represented the grandeur, authority, and historical continuity of the Qing dynasty. Its loss was a psychological blow, a visible symbol of the empire's inability to protect its heritage. The intrusion of foreign powers and ideas also challenged traditional values. Missionaries, trade, and Western culture exposed Chinese society to new concepts, technologies, and religions. Some embraced these changes, finding opportunity and knowledge, while others resisted, clinging to Confucian traditions and cultural pride. The tension between tradition and modernization became a defining feature of late 19th century China. The opium crisis itself had a moral and psychological effect. Addiction was not merely physical, it undermined self-discipline, family structures, and social cohesion. Communities saw the slow decay of vitality and authority as addiction spread, leaving an enduring mark on collective memory. The weakening of the Qing dynasty, combined with social, economic, and political pressures, set the stage for widespread internal unrest. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850-1864, already simmering before the Second Opium War, erupted into full-scale civil war. Millions died in the ensuing conflict, which challenged both the emperor's authority and traditional social structures. Other rebellions followed, including localized uprisings and secret society movements. Many were fueled by discontent over economic hardship, heavy taxation, and foreign interference. The presence of opium, which sapped health and labor capacity, worsened the empire's ability to respond. China's once powerful internal governance structure was stretched to the breaking point. Local militias, regional armies, and provincial leaders gained autonomy as the central government struggled to maintain control. The empire, though still ruling nominally, was increasingly decentralized and weakened from within. The treaties resulting from the Opium Wars marked the beginning of a long period of foreign and unequal agreements. Britain, France, Russia, and later other powers demanded privileges, extraterritorial rights, and access to ports and trade. China's sovereignty was compromised in unprecedented ways. Foreign ambassadors resided in Beijing. Foreign troops occupied key cities. Trade regulations favoured foreigners. The legal system was undermined by extraterritoriality. These treaties were not merely symbolic. They fundamentally altered the balance of power and eroded the authority of the Qing government. The century of humiliation, as later historians would call it, had its roots in the Opium Wars. The conflict demonstrated that military and technological inferiority could translate directly into loss of sovereignty, wealth, and respect on the international stage. Beyond politics and economics, the Opium Wars catalyzed lasting social change. Chinese society became increasingly aware of the need to reform and modernize. Intellectuals, officials, and reformers debated the best path forward, with some advocating adaptation to Western technology and methods, while others emphasized preserving traditional values. Port cities like Shanghai and Canton became cultural melting pots, exposing Chinese citizens to foreign languages, ideas, and commerce. New social classes emerged, including a merchant class connected to international trade. The old Confucian order, while still influential, faced new pressures from a rapidly changing world. By the late 19th century, the consequences of the Opium Wars were clear. China's economy was weakened and heavily influenced by foreign powers. The Qing dynasty's political legitimacy had eroded. Social structures were strained by addiction, population pressures, and regional unrest. Cultural identity was challenged by foreign intrusion and modernization pressures. The Opium Wars were more than military conflicts. They were transformative events that reshaped China's society, economy, and worldview. They revealed vulnerabilities, created dependencies, and forced the empire to confront a new global reality. Yet even in this time of crisis, China was resilient. Intellectuals, reformers, and ordinary citizens sought ways to survive and adapt. Communities continued to farm, trade, and educate. Families struggled to protect their children from addiction. Officials worked, often imperfectly, to restore order and defend the empire. The Opium Wars had altered the course of history, leaving a legacy of pain, loss, and transformation. But they also set the stage for China's eventual efforts at reform and modernization and national renewal, a long journey that would continue into the 20th century. The empire had been shaken, but it was not yet broken. In the quiet years that followed, China began to reflect, learn, and adapt, planting the seeds for future recovery even as the shadows of opium and foreign lingered,